So the phone call has finally happened between President Trump and President Putin, a long phone call.
What did they discuss? What does it mean for Ukraine? What does it mean for the Middle East, for the wider world? That is what we're going to discuss on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's James in the studio.
And it's Alex in the studio.
Now, on the second half of Newscast, on this episode, we're going to be talking about this call between President Trump and President Putin. But first, we're going to look at the benefit changes, big changes, or potential changes, some of them, to benefits, welfare, that have been announced by the UK government today. Alex, this is your great skill of many.
Don't know about that, James.
Please, would you take us through some of these changes?
Yeah, so we've been talking about this for some time, a lot of speculation about what the government might do. And it's worth saying that what the government claims it's trying to do is, yes, get that benefit bill down, because we know it's been going up and is forecast to go up even more. But what they say they really want to do is help people get back into work. And a big focus of this has been people that claim benefits, health-related benefits and disability-related benefits. So we finally got the detail of this, and I think there are just some really key headline measures. One of the biggest changes that's going to happen is a change to personal independence payments. Now, these are payments that are made to disabled people or people with long-term health conditions. They're not means tested. They're not to do with whether you're in work or not. It is about the state helping you cover the extra costs that are related to your disability or to your illness. And what they're going to do is change the way that that is assessed, whether or not you're eligible for those payments, and effectively make it stricter, make it harder for people to get those payments. And that's going to come in from November next year. It's also worth saying that the government said that the people with really severe conditions won't constantly be reassessed. So they're effectively trying to say, we're going to make sure that, the people who are getting this really need it, but the people who really need it will constantly get it without having to be constantly reassessed. Another element to this, universal credit, on top of that, you can get a health-related top-up to your universal credit. Now, the government's going to change this system as well. And what it's going to do, it says, is make universal credit a bit more generous, but make those health-related top-ups for people that might start claiming in the future less generous.
And that's what's sometimes called incapacity benefit.
That's right. And the reason the government says is because they think that there's been a weird quirk in the system which is encouraging people to claim the health bit of universal credit where you can get more money. So they're trying to look at that balance again. And another bit of that is that for people who are aged under 22, the government is saying they want to look at the idea of people not getting that health bit of the universal credit benefit at all if you're under 22.
The logic being that they want to try to help those people get into education, employment or training and not be on benefits.
That's right, because the big driver behind all of this from a ministerial perspective is that they think the particular issue is for younger people of working age who are, you've just seen the numbers go up for the amount of them who are claiming these kind of health-related benefits. So they're really targeting attention on that. But we already had some grumbles from some of the Labour benches, and there's been quite a lot of reaction from people who are saying a big concern is about what this might mean for individuals.
Now, in a minute, we'll be going through some of that detail with the government minister and asking him to explain what Labour's doing and why. I will make one little side note, which is that personal independence payment is not the benefit, broadly speaking, that you get in Scotland now, because that's been devolved and it's something called adult disability payment, which is very similar. But how this will affect that is not yet clear, and that's probably a discussion for another day, but it's just worth pointing out. But first, Chris is here. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
So we've been talking about these changes to welfare, cuts to the welfare bill for some time. It's been pretty heavily trailed. So given everything that we expected and where we are today, was it bigger? Was it less big? Was it broadly in the same vein of what you were expecting and what we'd heard before?
I think it was broadly in the same vein in terms of the arguments that the government was making about what they see as an unsustainable benefits bill that is continuing to climb, and by the way, will continue to climb just at a lower rate than it would have done without these changes, and how they are trying to make an argument that it is fair both to recipients or potential recipients of benefits and wider taxpayers. What I've been really struck by, Alex and James, in the last few days, and by the way, even now that it's not 100% clear, is that, unlike some other moments for government, say pre-budget or whatever, with things where you're talking about benefits changes, for recipients, perfectly reasonably, they're asking, what impact will this have on me? And yes, now they might have a greater sense compared with some of the briefing that we were reporting on in the last week or so. But even now, because of the complexity of individuals' personal circumstances, then the complexity of the system, and then a system that is changing, there'll be lots and lots of people thinking, I actually don't know the extent to which this is going to have an effect. And then there'll be others who will be deeply worried that it will have an effect, and they might be nervous around that. And then a sizable chunk of people who may not even have had any encounters with the benefit system yet, but may do in the future, or may, as a result of these changes, no longer have an encounter, or it may indeed have an encounter that kind of comes to nothing in terms of getting any benefit because of the tightening of various criteria. So, yeah, I think a big moment for this government, a big moment for a Labour government. I think a Labour government can only kind of do this sort of thing, at the beginning of a term in office when the kind of grievances on their backbenchers haven't stacked up too high. And then secondly, when they've got a whopping majority. And they have both of those things, which is probably why now is the time to do it, over and above or alongside that argument that they're making that they have, in their view, no choice because the whole thing's just got unsustainable.
That having been said, Chris, what is the mood there among the Labour Party about this? And what were you picking up today? Give us a sense of colour for what was happening in the House of Commons and in and around it.
Yeah, it's conflicted and it is nuanced. So I don't think I think you'd barely encounter any MP of any political persuasion, any political party, who would try and argue that the current system is fine and nothing needs to change. So there's a widespread recognition that change was necessary. Plenty say that the rate of increase of the benefits bill needs to come down, and some will say it should be cut precisely. It should definitely go down. And then amongst MPs, and in particular Labour MPs, as I say, you get nuance, because MPs will say that they'll simultaneously hear from constituents who say there has to be a change, that there's too many people who could be working and are not and are living off the state. But then also people who will sit opposite them in a surgery, a constituency surgery on a Friday afternoon, and will say, look, I am really struggling with this form, or there's been a reassessment and that means I'm going to lose out and I really can't work, but now I'm really struggling to work out how I'm going to be able to, afford to heat the house or buy the food or whatever. So you hear both of those things. Now, from the government's perspective, I think they were keen to emphasise that they've taken account of those who are most severely impacted by physical or mental health conditions that can stop them from working. They wanted to emphasise that the personal independence payment in England and Wales and Northern Ireland isn't going to be frozen. In other words, there won't be a real terms cut once you've accounted for rising prices. That it won't be means tested. In other words, what you will get irrespective of your income, your means. It'll purely be determined by your capability to do things, your level of illness. So that's the argument that they hope will resonate. But I was struck that on the Labour benches, there's a nervousness. There is a nervousness because, when you're looking at something as complex as the benefit system, you've got these billions, these giant numbers in the national spreadsheets that ministers argue means you've got to act. But then in the end, this comes down to an individual seeing an amount of money dropping into their bank account or not, and then trying to budget around it. And people who, for various reasons, might regard themselves as, really, really reliant on that help. And that's the sharpest edge of domestic politics I can think of, really, in terms of a decision that a minister has to make. And so that's why I think you encounter that kind of nervousness about how this plays out, how it goes down, the actual reality for people in the coming years as these changes work their way through.
It's so interesting, Chris, because you would have been, I'm guessing, watching it from in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
But I was watching it, on the telly, watching Liz Kendall at the dispatch box making her statement. And you had the Liberal Democrats raising the point about they think there needs to be more focus on fixing the health and social care system to help some people who are currently getting these health and disability benefits off the NHS waiting lists and back into work. You had the SNP who were expressing some opposition to it, the Green Party expressing some opposition to it. But what really struck me, Chris, was that actually you had some Labour MPs expressing concern about this proposal, more so than the Conservatives. And the Conservatives were actually just saying, look, we think you should have gone further and faster. If it's too little, too late. I just wonder where you think the opposition to this, if there is opposition to this, is really going to come from.
Yeah, it's a good question, because there isn't certainly from the Conservatives, there isn't first principles opposition. They accept that the sort of direction of travel of the government is, as they see it, the right one. And so actually it then becomes about scale and it becomes about detail. So, they're arguing that the government should be doing more. The obvious retort from Labour is, well, hang on a minute, why didn't you do more when you were in government for years and years and years? And so from a Labour perspective, this sounds quite crude when we're talking about the specifics of individual people's lives, but in the political strategy of this, Labour is positioning itself where it's two of its principal rivals, if you like, the Conservatives and Reform, and to an extent, actually, the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish National Party, where they can say, they try and make an argument that they're occupying what they might argue is the sort of common ground or the sensible ground or whatever. Because if you leave your opponents in a place where they're quibbling over detail, now don't get me wrong, detail can really, really matter in this. But in terms of the bigger picture political argument, you can leave your opponents with at least a limited amount to say, if not nothing to say.
It's really interesting, and I very strongly suspect we're going to be talking about it a lot on Newscast over the next couple of years. Chris, thank you so much.
Ta.
So we can talk about this now with Torsten Bell, who is a government minister who's officially responsible for pensions, but in this department.
You promised me one day you will talk to me about.
Well, pensions matter.
You won't make us. Pensions do matter.
Pensions matter.
A lot, but not today.
These big changes to welfare do sit under your department, even though they're not directly in your brief. But it's maybe worth reminding newscasters that actually you've got a bit of a different hat on now, because they might know you from Newscast when you were in charge of the Resolution Foundation, which was a think tank that
was spurious flattery.
Did a lot.
I think you're putting a lot of faith in people's
well, I'm just
memory of think tank
reminding
members
our
of staff.
newscasters.
You were on a lot.
Yeah, well, you might feel familiar to them.
So I have been through some changes, even if reasonable people will not have noticed.
What's it like on this side of the fence compared to the other side of the fence?
In the end, so I spent 10 years working at the Resolution Foundation, and I spent a lot of time looking at on the economic policy side, and I spent a lot of time drawing charts of things that were going wrong. And I thought after 10 years, it's time to start changing the charts, not just drawing them. So it is different because you're doing things rather than writing about them. It's different in terms of the input you get, which is from, knocking on doors every Saturday or speaking to people, in Swansea all day on a Friday, rather than just looking at spreadsheets. Those are different things. They're both important. I'm not denigrating spreadsheets, but both are really important and they give you a different perspective.
On a day like this, when you were in charge of the Resolution Foundation, you would be one of the people that pulls through all the detail of the government documents and looks through all the policy and then comes up with a kind of verdict. And the Resolution Foundation have done that today. And what they say about these changes is that they deliver tiny income gains for up to 4 million households at the cost of major income losses for those who are too ill to work or no longer qualify for disability benefit support. Are they wrong?
They're partial, is the answer, because I think what you need to do is to step back and say, what is happening to the country? And what's happening is we've created a benefit system that is writing off millions of people as too sick to work, and we can't carry on with that. And we've created a disability benefit system that is seeing huge numbers of people flowing onto it, far more than was ever intended. And if we allow that to continue, we won't have a system there that's to protect the most vulnerable. So I understand why people kind of just looking at their spreadsheets will come to conclusions, and we can go into the weeds of that. But big picture, the country isn't in a sustainable position. We can't have a benefit system that writes this many people off. It's not good for them. It's not good for anyone else. And I'll make one specific point, which is when having run the spreadsheets and the models in the past, right? If you plug in a change and say, what does this benefit change do in isolation, then you wouldn't have picked up the disgraceful problem that's been the benefit system over the last few years. You can't answer the question, which is why, when the number of people receiving disability or incapacity benefits is surging, is disability poverty rates not falling? Because the implication is people will get poorer because you're changing the system. But huge numbers of increased people receiving the benefits is not driving down the poverty rates, far from it. And, we've got more than 1 in 5 people with a disability who are living in poverty. So I make no apologies for saying our job in government is to change the system, and that's what we're going to do.
So we'll go into some of those details in a minute. We've been, Alex and I, going through the Green Paper, and we've
very glad someone's reading it.
Been
We've
listening.
read the whole thing. We've read the whole
We have.
This is a non-credible claim.
We'll go.
I'm going to test you both in a second on page 73.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to that, but we'll test you first. And just on the general principle, do you accept that there may well be newscasters listening to this who think you are coming for their benefits that they think they need?
I think people actually right around the country, and I was, talking to people at a support group for people with mental health challenges on Friday, actually, and another group with similar challenges, and everybody thinks the system needs to change. Now, directly to your question, so I haven't been a politician long enough not to answer it. So directly to your question, will there be people that are worried and have been worried by the news coverage of recent weeks? Yes, there will be. And I feel a lot of sympathy for them. What that is reflecting is that we've got a broken system. And people in it are finding that hard to deal with. And yes, but because it's so bad and it forces people to prove whether they can or can't work at all, then people do worry about the changes to that. So I understand why people are worried, but my job and our job is to fix that broken system. And in the end, that is in everybody's interests.
Well, let's go to some of the detail. Let's start with PIP, Personal Independence Payment, the tightening of the assessment criteria for the living component of that benefit. Presumably, by tightening those criteria, we are to understand that you think people are getting that benefit at the moment who should not be getting it. How many do you think are in that category?
The number of people flowing onto PIP is now at 1,000 a day, every day.
Extra.
Flowing onto it. No, people being awarded PIP is 1,000 a day. That is not the volume that was ever intended. If we leave that, then the current caseload for PIP will rise from 2 million to 4 million over the course of a decade. Now, if we do that, you will not have a sustainable system, and you will end up cutting the rate of the benefit, which will affect those with the most severe disabilities. So that is why we're making a change. So if you're asking me straight, are too many people flowing onto PIP for it to be a sustainable system? The answer is yes.
How many?
I think everyone.
How many?
No, I'm not going to. Don't ask a silly question about guessing on the numbers.
No, that's
too many are coming on. But
it's
important because it's not for politicians to judge individuals' needs. We set a system. The system explicitly has clinicians making the decision about whether individuals can do certain activities or not, and that's right, and that's how it should be. But I'm not hiding from your overall question, which is that the eligibility changes will mean that over time a significant number of people would not receive PIP. That's absolutely right, and that's what we have to do to make sure the system is sustainable.
Just one more from me for a second. Let's look at the detail of that then, because you are going to make it harder to get PIP. And one of the ways in which you're going to make it harder is how the scoring of this questionnaire works. We've printed this off from the Citizens Advice Bureau, the copy of the PIP questionnaire. So I put this to you and you tell me if this is fair and why, if that is the case, you're doing it. So, for example, if someone can't cook a simple meal, can only cook a meal in a microwave, needs prompting to be able to prepare or cook a simple meal. If somebody needs assistance to be able to get in and out of a bath or shower, if someone needs supervision or prompting to be able to manage going to the toilet, someone could be in a position where all of those things apply to them and you still say they're not eligible. Is that not an incredibly high and pretty harsh bar?
Well, I'll come and answer that specific question that you've raised about the detail of the system. But first of all, I want to say something because there'll be people at home listening to this that are currently receiving PIP. And so I want to say directly to them that I understand this debate will have made people nervous. And I want them to know there's no changes happening overnight. This system will not be introduced until November 2026. And then nobody will be brought forward for an assessment when they weren't already intended for that to happen. So I don't want people worrying about changes overnight, because I appreciate that will have been difficult for people hearing the news. And we're also consulting on support for those in the health and around their care for those that might fall out of PIP. But then directly on your question, so the way PIP works, it's not true that people that would qualify for the criteria you've mentioned, those will still qualify for points within the PIP system.
They're all below 4 points, which is the
I'm coming on to that, but those points will still count towards the overall number of points you're required to achieve to be eligible for that part of PIP. There's obviously the mobility element as well. What we're saying is that we need to focus the system on those with more severe disabilities, and one measure of that is that you receive at least 4 points in one element of the 10 elements of the PIP assessment. So, and in general, you've read some examples there, but I think most people haven't had experience of the system. So just to explain, in most cases, the difference between 2 and 4 points will be people, this isn't true across all the elements, but it will be broadly people that struggle with the task and may need an aid or help to do it, versus those that need much more significant support from another person to engage in that activity. That's the easiest way I can explain the change. Now, but that does tighten the eligibility. It does mean that some individuals won't receive the benefit, and I've been completely straightforward about that. But I'm saying that to you. Look, I say it's 1,000 people a day coming onto PIP. The growth in people receiving PIP is far faster than the growth in those reporting they have a disability. So we do have a broken benefit system. This is not just about the country being sicker, although that is a problem, which is why we're investing £26 billion in the health service. Is why we're making sure that there's 8,500 more mental health professionals in that health service. But this is more than that. This is about us saying that the rates flowing in have grown far faster than the actual problem within our society. And that's, I'm afraid, because the Tories did create a broken benefit system, and we do have to fix it.
So does that mean you think there are people who, coming back to James's point, you say the growth in the number of people who are disabled in this country isn't matching the number of people who are getting PIP? So there are people who are getting PIP who shouldn't be?
No, there's two things that are true. The country is becoming sicker. You've covered that in terms of rising mental ill health, and those are serious problems, and we need to make sure that we're tackling those, and I've outlined some of the ways we're doing it. But the inflows into incapacity and actually to disability benefits are growing faster than that. Those people are passing a PIP assessment, and the clinicians are making decisions. So I'm not judging those people. I'm just explaining that is not a sustainable basis. And our job as a party that ran on a platform promising change is to face up to some of the big problems facing the country and to change a system where it's not working. Because the easy thing is for everyone. Look, what are the Tories? The Tories said some of these problems existed. In my previous life, I drew the chart showing that these problems were really significant. But people want a government that actually deals with the problems, doesn't just write about them. It
sounds like you're echoing something that Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, said, which is that she called it a perverse incentive in the system at the moment, which basically, in kind of, layman's language, my take was that what you're effectively saying is that you think that there's been an incentive for people to get on to the sickness bit of some of these welfare claims rather than just the people who are looking for work. So one of the things you're doing is making it more generous, universal credit, standard universal credit, but less generous on the incapacity bits of universal credit, right?
Yes. So we're moving from a discussion about disability benefits, personal independence payments, and moving to incapacity benefits, which are means tested and happen through the universal credit system. Absolutely. The Tories created a complete disaster of a system that said to people, if you are just receiving the basic rate of universal credit, there's a danger you'll be destitute, and there's a very strong incentive because we keep freezing that basic element. Remember, they froze it for 4 years before 2020, but we didn't freeze the health element, and because they set up a binary test, the idea that someone is either completely fine to work, then they should receive a low amount of benefit and a huge amount of conditionality and pressure from the system, and another load of people that should prove they're too sick to work, and then they should receive, one, a high rate of benefit, but importantly, no support to work. And
if you look at that,
I am, but let me explain why. Because the test that was used to prove if someone is too sick to work used to see 1 in 5 people declared they were too sick to work. And what is it today? 2 in 3. That is a broken system created by the Conservatives who abolished the part of the system that allowed you to be in a halfway house in 2017 and made it completely binary, that people are too sick to work or they can work, and that is not how humans exist.
So you're trying to correct that, but I want to ask you about one element of that, which is that for people who are under 22, you're saying you might say to them, you can't get that health-related element of universal credit at all. So if I'm 18, 19, and I'm not in education, I'm not in training, I'm struggling to get into one of those...
Which a million people now are.
Perhaps because of my mental health, but perhaps because of my mental health, I'm struggling to get a job or to find a training placement. Why are you saying to them that you having less money is going to help?
There's lots of elements to that. Now, first thing to say is those people would certainly be entitled to PIP.
Maybe under the new criteria.
Maybe, but they'd be entitled to apply for PIP in those circumstances. But if we look at the evidence in terms of very significantly rising mental ill health amongst young people, and the evidence is very clear that work is one of the best things for dealing with that. It doesn't make it go away. These problems are very complicated, but it's certainly beneficial actually for your physical as well as your mental health to be working. If we look at the data on who wants to work and is in these positions, it is particularly younger people. And if you look at the long-term effects on all of us, if we are out of work in our early years, it is very, very significant indeed. And I want to be really clear, we are also saying the support is going to be there to help you. £1 billion, new Pathways to Work programme, making sure that you are not written off because the Tories put you through an assessment and said you're never going to work again. And doing that to someone who's 20 is a bonkers way to run a country.
Just putting it in the context, though, and, you know, there are other things happening in government where you are recognising some of the pressures that young people might be facing.
Absolutely.
So things around social media, which is talked about an awful lot. We've heard some of the absolutely devastating examples where young people's lives have been really impacted by stuff like social media. So on the one hand, you've got that going on, perhaps housing insecurity, perhaps struggling just to find a secure job or something else. And on the other hand, you're saying, well, we want you to get back to work, but, you know, up until you're 22, we're going to take away some of the money that you might otherwise have been entitled to. I'm just not clear how that's going to help.
Well, not taking away. Those that are currently receive the benefit will continue to receive.
That you otherwise might have been entitled to.
Yes, and we're going to be saying, but we're going to give you more support. And do you know what we're also going to have? A functioning NHS. £26 billion going into the NHS through tax rises that the Tories and every other party have opposed day after day, so that we bring down waiting lists, we employ 8,500 more mental health workers, so that we say to young people, not only do we think it's in your interest to work, but we're going to support you to do it, and we're going to support your health too.
So, on that very point, the Green Paper points out that 2 in 5 people on incapacity or disability benefit are currently on an NHS waiting list. I suppose the question is about the cart being potentially before the horse here. Isn't it the case that stripping some of those people of their benefits before you've fixed the NHS, and therefore given them the immediate prospect of treatment, is going to make things worse for them?
No, we've got to do both. We've got to have a functioning...
But you have to fix the NHS first, don't you?
I'm going to come to that. We've got to do both. And we're already fixing the NHS. You've seen the release last week on waiting lists coming down month after month. We've got to do both. Fixing the NHS is part of our economic plan. When people say, oh, the budget, it had to raise some taxes, that's bad for growth, I'm saying, no, we're fixing the NHS. That does require hard choices on tax. We've been completely upfront about that. That is an economic strategy because the country cannot afford 2.8 million people to be out of work because they're sick, and neither can those people. That is not what success looks like. No other country in the G7 has seen their employment rate fall since the pandemic. So they are the same thing now. Directly on your question on the ordering, we are doing both at the same time. So the changes that we are introducing to the disability and incapacity benefit system are not starting immediately. They'll be coming in, there'll be a bill being introduced. It'll be fully debated. We're talking about 2026, the autumn of 2026, in terms of the changes to PIP. And we are obviously running hell for leather at improving the NHS at exactly the same time. And people that are already on those benefits will receive transitional protection, including on the point you made about the health element for people who are already receiving that in the universal credit system. And people on PIP will only be reassessed at the point at which they would have been reassessed anyway. And reassessment tends to be up to 3 years. So we're doing both. They'll both be building over the course of this Parliament. But, you know, with the idea, some people say, oh, look, let's wait to not make any changes to this system till everything else is absolutely perfect. People like that are not facing up to the scale of the problems the country faces. That is an excuse to do exactly what the Tories did year after year when they watched the PIP numbers rise and did nothing about it. And we are not prepared to repeat that mistake.
OK, the clock's ticking and we've got a few things we want to quickly rattle through, if that's all right.
There was 100 questions asked in the House of Commons today.
I know.
Really?
100, yeah.
You're saying to employers, we're going to give workers additional rights, and that'll cost, arguably, some employers. We're going to require you to pay higher national insurance contributions and a higher minimum wage. And now you're saying to employers, we want you to also take on some inexperienced young people who might have a mental health issue or history. Why would any employer do that?
Well, employers often want to do this because they're often employing those people anyway. And then because we all focus on this as if there's people just sitting there out of work. What often happens is there's 300,000 people who fall out of work every year because of ill health. And one of the most important things that we haven't actually discussed here is about stopping that outflow, keeping people attached to their employer, and you're talking about the Employment Rights Bill providing more sick pay so that people they don't flow straight into the mainstream.
But my question was about the
system.
employer and the challenges for them.
Yeah, but my strong view is that better work is better for the workers, right, including those who have disabilities, because more flexible work will help on that front, and that's also included in the bill. But in the end, it's also the route to a higher productivity country where employers have loyal workers who think they're treated well, and that is just the absolute basics. Or that is the basis on which people will invest in the future of their workers, invest in the future of their companies. And this is a country that has seen no wage growth, basically, and no productivity growth for almost the entirety of the Conservative times in office. So if you're saying to me we shouldn't have good work because that's the way to, persuade employers to hire those with a disability, well, that's worked really well for the last 15 years, hasn't it? I'm not putting up with that anymore. Good work and support for those with disabilities go hand in hand.
Why, you said this is going to save £5 billion, but why not publish all of the impact assessments now? Because we've got to wait for that for another week until the spring
I'll give you the boring politician's answer, and then I'll give you another answer.
Just
give us that shortly.
Well, I'm going to go very briefly. Look, the answer is we respect the independence of the Office of Budget Responsibility, and we're not allowed to publish data that runs off the forecast that they will produce next week, and that includes all of the impact assessment that relates to these changes. So those will be published in the normal way alongside the OBR's wider economics data. That's the boring answer. The straight answer is I'm not hiding from the fact that there will be significant people who lose out of this, particularly over time. I'm just committed to them that this is a better system for the long term. Nobody will lose out overnight, and we have got to make sure that people get the support. And it's not just about work. For some people, it's about volunteering. It's just about getting out of the house. People need support, and that's what we're going to give them.
It's a really busy day, so thank you so much for your time. But I know
thank
you've
you
got
very
to
much.
run. We really
that was a lot of questions.
It was a lot of questions. We were crunching them in. But thank you
very
for
much.
coming back with your new ministerial hat on. I hope you come back to Newscast again.
I'd love to.
Really appreciate it.
Cheers.
Right, on to the other really big news story of the day, and that is this telephone call between President Trump of the United States and President Putin of Russia, talking about Ukraine, but not just Ukraine, other things as well.
Yeah, we don't know how long it lasted, but we're told it was a pretty long phone call. And we can talk about that now with Lyse Doucet. Hello, Lyse.
Lovely to be back in the studio with both of you.
Always lovely to have you. Thank you so much for your time. So we've had the second phone call that we know about between President Trump and President Putin, another long one. We've had this readout from the White House, which is effectively their version of what was said in that call. And there were a couple of things in there that struck me. So both leaders agreed the conflict needs to end with a lasting peace. They stressed the need for improved bilateral relations between the US and Russia. The blood and treasure that both Ukraine and Russia have been spending in this war would be better spent on the needs of their people. Just like tonally, what are you taking from this? It was a long phone call, right?
Blood and treasure, it's such an old phrase from last century.
Quite
wars.
a cliche as
but
well.
This has always been the main point of President Trump on any war. It's terrible that people are being killed. Stop the fighting. But his idea of peace is ending the war. We don't really have a clear sense of what peace means to him. And in this case, lasting peace. We don't know whether he discussed President Putin's maximalist demands, which he's shown no sign of in any of his statements. And in his treatment of Ukraine, which is basically he doesn't believe that Ukraine is a country that has a right to exist. It's not just about land, it's about sovereignty. He wants to get rid of the current government. He wants to keep all the land that he's occupied and take even more. So this seems, given the enormity of what it will take for the two to close the gaps between the two sides, this is only really a few inches, but important inches.
Another line, though, that's pretty striking is this conflict should never have started. That's in the readout, as they call it. I mean, it's pretty striking given that the American president is sitting down with Vladimir Putin, who ordered the invasion of Ukraine, to have a line in there saying this conflict should never have started. And yet, the whole tone of this seems to be, is this fair? Lyse, tell me if it's not, relatively supportive of President Putin from the White House's perspective. Is that fair?
If you take the whole, first of all, the lengthy telephone conversations, and of course the first one that we know about, the 90-minute one, startled people because it was a huge concession for the US president to speak at length to the Russian leader. President Biden had stopped it. All Western leaders had stopped it after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And that phrase you mentioned about the war should never have started, What they didn't include is when President Trump makes that phrase, and he often uses that phrase, it finishes by him saying, and if he had been in power, President Putin would never have invaded. And President Putin actually seemed to, at one point, actually said, yes, that's true, sending another flower towards the U.S. president. This is really elevating. For President Putin, the biggest victory in this is, first of all, he hasn't agreed to what Ukraine was basically forced, because President Trump is right, they have fewer cards, forced to accept unconditionally a complete 30-day ceasefire. And President Trump was very pleased that it happened. And let's bear in mind, the Ukrainians want this war to end. So do Russians. All that President Putin has accepted is just, I know we'll get into details, is attacks on energy infrastructure. But what he did get is the sense of that two world leaders are discussing the issues of the world. The war in Ukraine, but also the Middle East, Iran, other issues. And this really is a huge diplomatic win, a huge political win for President Putin to be back at the top table.
Exactly, as you said, some of the detail in there, because the proposal that Ukraine agreed to was a 30-day ceasefire in the first instance. But what this readout says, and I think it's been echoed in what we've heard from the Kremlin version of this phone call as well, is that they're talking about the peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, and then technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire and permanent peace. So what does that...
Well, they're kind of chopping it
about?
up. Of course, any end in attacks, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has repeatedly attacked the energy infrastructure of Ukraine, including in and around the Zaporizhia nuclear plant.
Which Trump was talking about, President Trump was talking about before this, wasn't he?
We're
going to talk about power plants.
The power plants are going to be part of it, to which, of course, everyone said, are you mad? You're risking Europe's biggest nuclear power plant. You're at risk of blowing up the continent. So of late, Ukraine has been attacking Russian oil installations. So on the other side of the ledger, Ukraine will think, well, you've yanked away from us one of our key tactics. But I think Ukrainians will welcome an end to the attacks. Okay, it's the end of the winter, the harsh winter. It's still very cold in Ukraine. We can see James Landale shivering on the roof. But the huge demands on the energy are not so much. But it's important, but it's a small slice. But what it does is it enables President Putin to say, I agree with you, President Trump. And he doesn't anger, at least so far as we can see. President Trump is putting on a brave face. It's not what he wanted, but at least he can say he got something.
And the Black Sea, Lyse, what can you just explain maybe a bit about the geography?
Yes.
Some newscasters may be familiar,
yes.
some may not,
yes.
and the strategic importance of that. Why is that on the table?
Russia has wanted to, as part of Russia's strategic objectives, it has tried to cut off all of Ukraine's access to the Black Sea, which of course would be not just a territorial issue, but would be a huge blow to Ukraine's economic fortunes, because it is a shipping nation. Hence, one of the first targets, which is now under Russian occupation, Mariupol. You'll remember, such a horrific attacks. It was completely pulverized. That was one of the main Black Sea, or Sea of Azov. Odessa has been in another major port on the Black Sea, has been more and more increasingly. And in fact, Russia of late has been targeting the energy infrastructure in Odessa. They've been shivering there in the dark. There have been repeated attempts, including one last year, which almost succeeded, to have some kind of an agreement to govern shipping in the Black Sea. Turkey has gotten involved. There was the issue of because of the grain shipments. And so it's also important that they've agreed that they will continue. It's not new. Efforts have been underway. Ukraine has scored some successes against Russian warships in the Black Sea. And Russia has also attacked on the Ukrainian side. So it's another important element, because we often focus on the land, but the Black Sea is hugely strategic for both Russia and Ukraine.
The other thing that we should talk about, and that was mentioned in this phone call between President Putin and President Trump, was the situation in the Middle East. And we had a situation on Monday night into Tuesday morning where there were these Israeli airstrikes.
Biggest airstrikes since the ceasefire came into force on January the 19th.
You might not have seen this yet, Lyse, but we've had some, as we've been discussing this, and we're recording this at about 10 to 7 on Tuesday evening, Benjamin Netanyahu has just been speaking.
Oh, yes.
And in the last few minutes, and he has said that combat in Gaza has resumed with full force. The strikes launched overnight and continued throughout today are just the beginning.
Yes, and we'd heard from Gidon Sar as well earlier saying that it's not just a one-off, which was the question when you had these really devastating airstrikes. Israel says that they are striking terror targets, is the phrase they always use. And the reports today said several very senior Hamas officials have been killed, but also a large number of civilians, including children. The numbers keep going up. Very shorthand. The Gaza ceasefire has always been fragile. There was always a worry that it would fall apart. The first phase, which went relatively well, ended weeks ago. They should be in the second phase. But Israel doesn't want to go to the second phase. It never did. It agreed to this deal under pressure. The second phase requires Israel to pull out its troops, in effect, to end the war. But what Israel is realizing is that while it has weakened Hamas, Hamas has not disappeared. It's not, to use the phrase that Israel wants to use, it has not been destroyed. So with the backing of the new U.S. administration, it basically has been rewriting the deal, saying we're not going to move to the second phase. We're going to extend the first phase. And on top of it, Hamas has to release more hostages, which wasn't the way the deal is supposed to work. So Hamas says, no, that wasn't the deal. So Israel is now ramping up the pressure, first cutting off the aid all this month. Today, Downing Street said that Israel risks breaching international humanitarian law by depriving Gaza of food. Electricity has also been cut off. And now the second front, the airstrikes. And behind it is the reality that Israel has already mobilized tens of thousands of troops to launch another ground operation. I don't know, you saw I don't know whether he indicated that the ground operation, but that's another card in his hand.
Just the beginning, the words that we had. I mean, I don't know what that means in reality in terms of on the ground.
But those details, I suppose, will be coming out in the next few minutes. As you say, we're recording it on Tuesday evening. But Israel says Hamas is still holding 59 hostages, most of whom are dead. They think that 24 are believed to be alive. And that, in the context of what the Israeli Prime Minister is now talking about, just the beginning of another phase, apparently, of military action against Gaza, surely is going to reignite, they never really went away, these bitter and painful divisions within Israel in terms of the Israeli government's action, because some people must be of course, more than anyone, the families of these hostages in such immense distress.
Hamas has already said that the airstrikes, we have to get confirmation of this, obviously, that one of the hostages has been killed and others have been injured. The families whose loved ones are still being held in Gaza, and there are many supporters, and they continue to grow. And the polls show that is the vast majority of Israelis believe that you have to put the hostages first, not the destruction of Hamas, which are said to be Israel's two war aims. And Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli President Isaac Herzog continue to say that these are the two war aims in parallel. But the evidence is that every day the war goes on is another day which puts the lives of Israeli hostages at even greater risk. And the hostages, the families, have always felt that always accused Prime Minister Netanyahu, even though he denies it, of not putting those interests first. And if you in Israeli media today, they're telling the stories of the despair of the families. The protests continue to intensify, and they see politics in this deadly cocktail. They think that one of the reasons why there's, of course, a lot, Prime Minister Netanyahu would deny this, is because Prime Minister Netanyahu has to get a budget through Parliament by the end of the month. And his right-wing allies are making it clear that if he ends the Gaza war, they'll bring about an end to his government. Now, that seems really, really cynical, but if you pick up any of the Israeli media, that's one of the main discussions today, that Prime Minister, that's had long been the accusation. Again, he would deny that Prime Minister Netanyahu puts his political survival ahead of the lives of the hostages.
So what is happening in the world today is pretty incredible, isn't it? If you're a diplomat, if you're involved in the business of international peace and geopolitical talks, we hardly know which way to look, Lyse, at the moment. You know, we've got this potential ceasefire talks in Ukraine. We've got, it looks like potentially, and I say this carefully, potentially a breakdown of any advance towards or sustaining of a ceasefire in the Middle East. There is an enormous amount for any diplomat involved in this to be thinking about all at once.
But you also have the Red Sea, because the US has now launched airstrikes against the Houthis. And they're indicating that will also go on for weeks.
Yemen.
In Yemen, yes. And because they say until they stop disrupting commercial shipping in the Red Sea lanes, which the Houthis said if there was no Gaza, if the Gaza ceasefire fell apart, if aid did not return to Gaza, they would resume their attacks. And so they have. So all of a sudden, then these attacks, there's another front has opened up. And behind that is a warning from President Trump in his capital letters, they're hell to pay to the Houthis, but also to the Iranians, who are a key ally of the Houthis, a message to Iran as well. So there's circles within circles, wheels within wheels, wars within wars. It's very, and all of this at a time when many of our newscasters will remember that in his inauguration speech, President Trump said, "I want to be known as a peacemaker." And he does say he wants to end the wars. But in trying to end the wars, as we often see, sometimes the wars get even worse.
Lyse, thank goodness we have you to talk us through it all, take us through it all. Thank you so much, as ever.
I sometimes say to producers, it's not that you're confused, it is confusing.